Hey guys, tonight we slip back 1,000 years into the heart of medieval England. Picture yourself in a world of candlelight, smoky hearths, and muddy roads where kings wore crowns but mud still caked their boots. You probably imagine knights clanking everywhere, peasants bowing all day, and castles stuffed with banquets. But trust me, you probably wouldn't survive even the first week here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments, because I love knowing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture medieval England crawling with knights, armor flashing in the sun, horses snorting, lances lowered at every street corner. It's the image every video game and Hollywood movie sells you. Everyone, either a brave warrior or a damsel, watching from the battlements. If that were true, then every little English town would sound like a blacksmith's workshop, clanging helmets instead of church bells. But the truth, armor was a rare sight, and most of the people you'd meet were bent over a plow, not charging into battle. The flip is stark. About 90% of the population were peasants, tied to farmland, and their armor was a rough wool tunic patched at the elbows. Imagine trudging through misty fields at dawn, your breath clouding the air as you guide an ox to break stubborn soil. For these farmers, the only metal they touched daily was the iron tip of a plowshare, not a gleaming sword. And even that was often borrowed from the local lord. Here's your mainstream fact. In the year 1000, England's social pyramid placed peasants at the bottom, and knights were an elite sliver above them, less than 2% of the population. That means for every armored rider, there were dozens of barefoot villagers scratching out a living. Now, the quirky tidbit records show that knights sometimes refused to wear full armor because it was too hot, too heavy, or frankly, too expensive. Think of it like someone owning a luxury sports car, but only driving it on weekends. And then the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the idea of universal knighthood was even real before the Norman conquest of 1066. Some say knight was a later invention, retroactively pasted onto earlier warriors. So that endless parade of clanking helmets in your imagination might just be Hollywood reruns. Your mini-character POV arrives in the form of Edith, a farmer's daughter. She squints at the horizon one dusty afternoon and spots a single armored knight riding past. To her, it's like seeing a celebrity, dazzling and terrifying at once. She tugs her brother's sleeve. "Look, William, a knight." And just like that, the moment is gone, the horse kicking mud onto her only dress. Joke 1. You'd expect jousts on every corner, but real peasants probably jousted only with chickens when they stole bread. Joke 2. Armor was so rare that if you wore a shiny helmet into a village, kids would probably throw stones at it just to hear the noise. Joke 3. And let's be honest, if every man had armor, laundry day would be chaos. Sorry dear, can't wash your tunic. The chainmail's hogging the tub again. And here comes a callback. Said remember how I said castles weren't cozy palaces? Hold that thought, because just like knights, castles didn't look the way you expect either. So next time you imagine medieval England, don't see an endless army of knights, see muddy boots, calloused hands, and the occasional gleam of armor like a rare comet streaking across a dark sky. You imagine castles as cozy palaces, their great halls glowing with golden light, fires crackling in every corner, and silk-draped beds waiting for you to collapse into. In your mind, it's like checking into a medieval five-star hotel, complete with banquets delivered on silver trays. But step inside the truth, and you'll probably ask for a refund before the first draft chills your bones. The flip is harsh. Castles were not built for comfort. They were built for defense. Stone walls 3 meters thick kept enemies out, but they also kept cold in. Imagine lying in a chamber where the only window is a narrow slit, the wind whistling through like an unpaid flute player. At night, smoke from the central hearth gathered under the roof beams, stinging your eyes until they watered. Bedding with straw mattresses alive with fleas, and if you were unlucky, rats conducted midnight patrols right across your blanket. Here's your mainstream fact. The first castles in England were mostly wooden Matandabalee structures, thrown up quickly after the Norman conquest. Stone castles arrived later, and even then, they were fortresses, not spas. Quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found that castle latrines called garderobes often emptied directly into the moat. Imagine standing proudly above your enemies, only to realize your waist just landed on their helmets. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue how much time lords and ladies actually spent in their castles. Some suggest castles were seasonal or symbolic, while manor houses and traveling courts handled daily life. Your mini-character POV tonight belongs to Thomas, a weary guard on night watch. He stomps his feet on the battlements, breath clouding in the cold. He mutters, "If my lord calls this comfort, I'd rather sleep in the stables." And honestly, the horses might have agreed. Joke 1. You think castles were warm? Nope. They were medieval refrigerators with bonus rats. Joke 2. If you wanted privacy, the only place quieter than your drafty chamber was the latrine, and even that echoed. Joke 3. Forget breakfast in bed, more likely breakfast asterisk with asterisk bedbug. Callback time. Remember Edith from the last section, staring at a knight like he was a celebrity. Well, if she ever peeked into a castle, she'd probably laugh. That glittering hero slept under the same leaky roof she did, just with fancier fleas. So while Hollywood shows you glowing banquets and roaring fires, real castles were cold, smoky, and often smelled worse than the battlefield outside. The true luxury wasn't the stone walls, it was surviving the draft. You probably imagine peasants in medieval England living like mute chess pieces, silent, powerless, and bent in endless submission to lords and kings. The myth paints them as background extras, bowing, toiling, and never speaking unless spoken to. If the Middle Ages were a movie, peasants didn't even get lines. But peel back the parchment, and you'll find those voiceless villagers actually spoke louder than you think. The flip is surprising. Villages had their own courts, assemblies, and surprisingly lively debates. Picture a ring of thatched huts, neighbors gathered under the open sky to settle disputes about sheep, fences, or who stole whose chicken. No king rode in to solve it. Villagers themselves heard the case and voted. Imagine your neighbors deciding your fate, armed with gossip sharper than any sword. It wasn't democracy as you know it, but it was far from silence. Mainstream fact: Medieval England ran on the manorial system, and peasants were bound to land. Yet they held local courts called courtleets, where community voices mattered. Quirky tidbit. Records show villagers occasionally fined their own lord if he neglected duties like maintaining a mill or bridge. Imagine fining your boss because he didn't fix the office coffee machine. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue how much influence peasants truly wielded. Some call them pawns. Others see them as active players shaping local law. Step into a mini-character POV. Margaret, a widow in a small village, raises her hand in court. She accuses her neighbor of letting pigs trample her garden. The jurors, her neighbors, they whisper, argue, and finally fine the neighbor to pence. Margaret smiles, not because justice is grand, but because, for once, her voice changed something. Joke 1. You think peasants were voiceless, but honestly, medieval gossip made Twitter look slow. Joke 2. Imagine jury duty, where your neighbor already hates you for borrowing his fair trial, right? Joke 3. And let's face it, medieval courts weren't silent, solemn chambers. They were the original village group chats, just with more mud. Callback to castles. While lords froze in drafty towers, villagers huddled in smoky halls, arguing about pigs. Which one sounds more lively? Exactly. So no, peasants weren't just faceless, powerless shadows. Their voices echoed in village courts, and though kings wore crowns, the everyday disputes of peasants carried a power Hollywood never shows you. You've heard it 1,000 times. The Middle Ages were nothing but the Dark Ages. Endless gloom, no progress. Everyone stumbling around with torches while waiting for the Renaissance to show up with a flashlight. It's a catchy myth, but if you lived in medieval England, you'd find sparks of light flickering everywhere, right under the mud. The flip is bright. While war and famine did strike, people were also inventing, crafting, and building. Picture carpenters shaping wooden watermills to grind grain, monks copying manuscripts with colored inks, and farmers tinkering with crop rotations that made harvests more reliable. The dark was only in candlelit rooms. The minds inside them were anything but. Mainstream fact: between 1000 and 1300, Europe's population nearly doubled, fueled by agricultural advances like the heavy plow and three-field system. Quirky tidbit. Some monasteries had herb gardens that doubled as experimental labs, where monks brewed remedies and occasionally very strong beer. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the label Dark Ages was propaganda invented by Renaissance writers to make themselves look smarter. Many now reject it entirely. Mini-character POV. Brother Elfric, hunched over parchment in a quiet scriptorium, dips his quill into ink. His hand aches, but when the candle flickers, he steadies it and whispers, "God willing, someone will read this 100 years from now." His work will outlive him by centuries. Joke 1. People call it the Dark Ages, but they had sunshine. England just also had a lot of rain. Joke 2. Monks copying books by hand probably dreamed of CTRL plus C and CTRL plus V. Joke 3. And let's be honest, crop rotation was just medieval people realizing even dirt needed a vacation. Callback. Remember Margaret from the village court? While she fought over pigs, somewhere a monk was inventing new brewing methods. Both, in their own way, kept the village alive. So, while it's tempting to imagine 1,000 years of gloom, medieval England was never truly dark. It glowed in its own uneven, flickering light enough to carry people forward long before the Renaissance claimed the spotlight. You probably imagine medieval kings ruling like gods, their every word law, their every command obeyed without hesitation. The myth is tempting. A single crown, absolute power, subjects trembling at every decree. But if you peek behind the throne, you'll notice that royal authority in England was more tangled than a thatched roof after a storm. The flip is humbling. Kings often wrestled with barons, the church, and even their own families. Picture a monarch shouting orders in the great hall, only to be met with a bishop's raised eyebrow or a noble's folded arms. Crowns glittered, yes, but the head beneath often sweated with anxiety. Henry II, for example, clashed with Archbishop Thomas Becket so fiercely that their feud ended in murder. Yet even that didn't silence the church. Kings might roar, but their growls echoed in a room full of other voices. Mainstream fact: in 1215, King John signed the Magna Carta, forced by rebellious barons to accept limits on his power, a medieval reminder that even kings had bosses. Quirky tidbit: some monarchs, strapped for cash, pawned their own royal jewels to fund wars. Imagine the king standing at a pawnshop counter, crown in hand. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Magna Carta truly mattered in 1215 or only gained legendary status centuries later. Was it a medieval milestone or just a temporary peace treaty? Mini character POV: Sir Robert, a loyal knight at court, watches as King John paces in fury, parchment trembling in his hand. Robert mutters to himself, "If my liege is this angry over a scroll, I'd hate to see him read the bill for the feast." Joke 1. Absolute power. More like negotiable power with frequent interruptions. Joke 2. Kings ordered taxes, but barons acted like medieval accountants. "Sorry, Your Majesty, that expense isn't approved." Joke 3. And the church. Think of them as history's first HR department, constantly reminding kings of the code of conduct. Callback: remember those drafty castles? Kings lived in them too, shivering just like their peasants, while pretending their thrones were made of fire and steel. Absolute rule feels less absolute when you're sneezing through a council meeting. So while legends crown kings as untouchable rulers, the truth is more delicate. Medieval monarchs balanced, bargained, and occasionally begged. The crown sparkled, but it was never as heavy with power as the myths would have you believe. You might picture medieval women as invisible, silent wives locked in kitchens, daughters fading into the background, and widows vanishing into poverty. The myth tells you they had no voice, no power, and no part in history except to stitch banners and pour ale. But step closer, and you'll see that women shaped medieval England in ways the myth forgets to mention. The flip is eye-opening. Women could run businesses, inherit property, and even rule in certain contexts. Abbesses commanded entire religious communities. Wealthy merchants' wives kept trade flowing, and queens influenced politics from behind and, sometimes, in front of the throne. Imagine Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, who traveled with armies, funded crusades, and negotiated with kings. Not quite the silent kitchen ghost you've been told about. Mainstream fact: in medieval towns, guild records show women often worked as brewers, clothmakers, and shopkeepers. Quirky tidbit. In some English villages, women were fined for nagging their husbands, proof that their voices were loud enough to irritate the court. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether women's freedoms grew or shrank after the Norman conquest, with some seeing greater restriction under stricter feudal law. Mini-character POV: Alice, a brewer's wife in York, hauls heavy casks into her tavern, wiping sweat from her brow. When a rowdy customer complains about the watered ale, she slams a jug on the table and says, "You want stronger, pay stronger." In that moment, she isn't invisible at all, she runs the room. Joke 1. People think medieval women were quiet, but honestly, even monks complained about being out-talked. Joke 2. If medieval women were powerless, then who kept entire taverns running while their husbands drank the profits? Joke 3. And let's be honest, half the nagging fines were probably just women reminding men to bathe. Callback. Remember Sir Robert watching King John fume over the Magna Carta? Imagine his wife at home reminding him that parchment isn't the only thing that needs signing the market rent is due to. So no, medieval women weren't shadows. They brewed, bargained, ruled, and argued. Their names may not fill the chronicles as often as kings and knights, but their presence was written into the very fabric of daily life. You picture medieval tables groaning with roasted boars, silver platters piled high with grapes, and goblets of wine spilling like rivers. Every night, in your mind, is a feast worthy of Game of Thrones meat, music, and merriment. The myth is delicious, but the truth tastes more like stale bread than sizzling. Flip the platter over. The average medieval diet in England was humble and repetitive. Most meals were bread, pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, and weak ale. Meat was a rare treat, usually saved for holidays or the tables of nobles, and even then, the roasted boar was less likely to appear than salted herring or dried beans. Imagine spending your life dreaming of bacon, only to get turnips instead. Mainstream fact: records show that peasants ate bread made from rye or barley, which was darker, rougher, and often filled with chaff. Nobles ate whiter wheat bread, a status symbol you could literally chew. Quirky tidbit. Archaeologists discovered bread loaves baked with grit and stone dust from grinding. Mills so bad that eating it slowly wore down people's teeth. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue how much meat peasants truly ate. Some say it was scarce. Others argue hunting, fishing, and small livestock kept protein in the diet more often than once thought. Mini-character POV: William, a farm boy, sits at the table staring into his wooden bowl of steaming pottage. He pokes it with a spoon and sighs, "If this is stew, then may God grant me a dream of..." His mother chuckles, "Dreams are free." Joke 1. You imagine medieval people drinking wine all day, but truth is, most drank weak ale, basically medieval Gatorade. Joke 2. Banquets did happen, but for peasants, the only buffet was a slightly larger chunk of bread. Joke 3. And if you think medieval food was exotic, remember half the spice rack was mud from the millstone. Callback. Remember Alice the brewer running her tavern? Most customers weren't demanding fine wine, they just wanted ale thick enough to hide the taste of river water. So forget endless feasts. The real medieval table was humble, hearty, and heavy on grains. A banquet might dazzle once a year, But for the other 364 days, dinner was pottage, bread, and the faint hope of a scrap of bacon. You've been told that medieval people were filthy beyond belief, never brushing, and living in a cloud of stink so thick you'd faint at the first whiff. The myth paints them as mud-caked zombies, their clothes stiff with dirt, their homes crawling with vermin. But step into the truth, and you'll discover that hygiene, while not modern, wasn't entirely forgotten. The flip surprises you. Medieval folk valued cleanliness more than the myth admits. Towns had public bathhouses, nobles bathed in wooden tubs filled with heated water, and even peasants washed in rivers or buckets when they could. Soap made from animal fat and lye was in use, though rough on skin. Imagine lowering yourself into a steaming tub after days in the fields, hardly a luxury spa, but better than the myth's dirt-caked caricature. Mainstream fact. Records show that King John of England ordered linen for frequent changes, suggesting clean clothes were part of status. Quirky tidbit. Bathhouses were sometimes social hubs where meals and even music were provided. Picture a medieval hot tub party, minus the chlorine. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the late medieval decline in bathing was due to fear of disease like plague spreading through water or simply economics and morality shifts. Mini-character POV. Agnes, a washerwoman by the river, slaps a tunic against the rocks. She grins as soap bubbles burst in the sun. Cleaner than the Lord's conscience, she mutters, wringing it out before hanging it to dry. Joke 1. You think medieval people never bathed, but honestly, even monks complained when someone skipped wash day. Joke 2. If hygiene didn't matter, why did bathhouses get nicknames like stews? Spoiler, not because of soup. Joke 3. And yes, rivers doubled as laundromats, but also as toilets, so timing your dip was crucial. Callback. Remember Thomas the castle guard stomping on battlements? After a freezing night shift, nothing beat warming his bones in a hot tub if he could afford it. Otherwise, back to the moat, which wasn't exactly SPO certified. So while it's easy to laugh at filthy medieval folk, the truth is more nuanced. They washed, they scrubbed, they cared about smelling decent, though by modern standards, let's just say deodorant shelves weren't exactly well stocked. You imagine medieval medicine as nothing but leeches and prayers, with doctors waving herbs while whispering Latin no one understood. The myth insists that if you got sick in medieval England, you were basically doomed. No cures, no science, just superstition and suffering. But while much of it was crude by today's standards, the truth reveals a mix of surprising remedies, experimental knowledge, and yes, some spectacularly strange ideas. The flip shows that medicine wasn't entirely hopeless. Herbal remedies, poultices, and even surgeries existed, carried out by barber surgeons and wise women. People understood the importance of diet, rest, and certain plants for healing. Imagine a healer grinding willow bark into powder for pain relief. What we now know contains salicylic acid, the basis of aspirin. Not so backward after all. Mainstream fact. Hospitals did exist in medieval England, often run by monasteries, providing care for the poor and sick, though they focused more on comfort than cure. Quirky tidbit. Physicians sometimes prescribed ground-up emeralds for stomach pain. Good luck explaining that to your jeweler. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval doctors genuinely believed in the four humors theory or used it more as a framework while also practicing trial and error treatments. Mini-character POV Geoffrey, a young monk in a monastery infirmary, leans over a patient with a fever. He whispers, "Lord, guide my hand," as he stirs a mixture of honey and herbs. The patient groans, then slowly drifts into sleep, the bitter taste fading into dreams. Joke 1. If leeches were the answer, medieval folks must have wondered why mosquitoes weren't doctors. Joke 2. Imagine paying your physician in chickens, only for him to say your diagnosis. Too many chickens. Joke 3. And really, if ground emeralds cured anything, half the nobility would have lived forever. Spoiler, they didn't. Callback, remember Agnes, the washerwoman by the river. Her soap did more for hygiene than half the town's doctors ever could. Sometimes clean clothes beat crushed gemstones. So while medicine in medieval England was often a gamble, it wasn't pure nonsense. Beneath the myths of bloodletting and charms, there were roots of real science, sprouting roots that would eventually grow into modern medicine. You probably imagine medieval England as a land where no one could read or write, where villagers stared blankly at marks on parchment like chickens at a chessboard. The myth paints the entire population as illiterate, with books locked away in monasteries and knowledge hoarded by a chosen few. But while literacy wasn't widespread, it wasn't extinct either. You'd be surprised who could read, write, or at least sign their name. The flip opens a new page. Monks and clerks were obvious readers, but merchants, guild members, and even some peasants learned enough to tally debts or read contracts. Picture a marketplace in York, where a cloth seller scratches notes in wax tablets, tracking who owes him what. He may not be quoting Latin poetry, but he's definitely not illiterate. And don't forget the traveling minstrels, who read the world aloud through song, carrying stories from village to village. Mainstream fact: by the 13th century, cathedral schools and later universities like Oxford began producing educated laymen, not just clergy. Quirky tidbit: some peasants used pictorial housemarks as signatures, basically medieval emojis carved onto documents. Scholarly debate. Historians argue whether literacy rates were really below 10% in early medieval England, or whether practical literacy numbers, contracts, reading prayers made the percentage higher than once assumed. Mini-character POV Hugh, a merchant's apprentice, squints by candlelight, copying letters on a scrap of parchment. He whispers, "If I can write my name, no man cheats me twice." His ink smudges, but his pride doesn't. Joke 1. If everyone was illiterate, who kept writing down all the taxes peasants hated? Joke 2. Imagine a medieval kid learning letters. Parents probably yelled, "Stop doodling runes on the sheep." Joke 3. And let's be honest, even literate monks had messy handwriting. Half of medieval scholarship was probably just trying to read each other's chicken scratches. Callback. Remember Geoffrey the monk mixing medicine? He likely copied herbal recipes into manuscripts, proof that books weren't just for prayers, but for practical survival. So while most of medieval England couldn't read novels, which didn't even exist yet, the myth of universal illiteracy is exaggerated. Words and symbols mattered, and the ability to read Devon a little could change a life forever. You might picture medieval England as one endless sermon, where the church smothered every laugh, silenced every fiddle, and made life a gray march from cradle to grave. The myth insists fun was banned, joy was sinful, and the only sound was chanting monks. But peek past the cathedral doors, and you'll hear something very different. Music, laughter, and the thud of dancing feet. The flip is lively. While the church was central, it didn't erase fun. Villages held fairs, maypole dances, wrestling matches, and ale-soaked festivals. Imagine a church bell ringing on Sunday morning, and the very same bell marking the start of a raucous midsummer feast in the square. People played dice, sang ballads, and even enjoyed traveling entertainers juggling in the mud. The Middle Ages weren't humorless. They were noisy, colorful, and often downright rowdy. Mainstream fact: church calendars were packed with feast days, sometimes giving peasants as many as 80 days off a year for religious festivals. Quirky tidbit: in some villages, locals held ale feasts where everyone contributed beer, creating medieval block parties that lasted for days. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether church officials tolerated popular games and festivals or constantly tried and failed to stamp them out. Mini character POV: John the Miller wipes flour from his face as he steps into the village square. He tosses dice on a barrel, laughing when he loses a penny. "God may take my soul," he says, "but tonight the ale's already taken my balance." Joke 1. Medieval England without fun. Please, why else invent bagpipes? Joke 2. If festivals were sinful, half the parish would have been in confession every Monday morning. Joke 3. And the maypole. Let's just say it wasn't built for quiet reflection. Callback. Remember Margaret taking her neighbor to court over pigs? Imagine that same jury staggering into the court the next morning, still hungover from the village ale feast. Justice may have been blind, but it probably also had a headache. So while faith shaped daily life, laughter and play wove through it too. Medieval England wasn't just a sermon, it was a stage, alive with jokes, games, and festivals that kept people's spirits burning brighter than the church candles. You might imagine medieval England as one long battlefield, swords clashing daily, banners waving over smoking villages, and peasants constantly diving for cover. The myth paints the Middle Ages as non-stop war, where peace was just the pause before the next raid. But if you stepped into the truth, you'd find that most lives weren't forged in fire, they were forged in soil. The flip: baronial rebellions, but the majority of the population spent decades without ever seeing a battle. Instead, they plowed, sowed, harvested, and prayed the weather would be kind. Imagine the rhythm of life marked not by trumpets of war, but by the crunch of sickles through barley. For peasants, the battlefield was the field itself, and victory meant a barn full of grain before winter. Mainstream fact: in the 11th and 12th centuries, England's economy was overwhelmingly agricultural, with farming seasons dictating the calendar more than war campaigns. Quirky tidbit: some villages held plow blessings at the start of the year, literally asking God to keep the soil safe from pests and drought, proof of where their true battles lay. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue how disruptive wars actually were. Did conflicts devastate whole regions, or were they short bursts, leaving most villages largely untouched? The answer depends on which chronicle you trust. Mini-character POV Edward, a weary farmer, bends over his field in late autumn. He hears rumors of distant knights marching, but shrugs. If they want to fight, let them, he mutters, wiping sweat from his brow. The weeds here fight harder than any army. Joke 1. You think everyone swung swords, but most people swung hosand, not the glamorous kind. Joke 2. If farming was war, weeds were the enemy that always respawned. Joke 3. And honestly, the only siege most peasants feared was a siege of hungry relatives at harvest. Callback. Remember Hugh the merchant's apprentice, learning to write his name? While he scratched letters on parchment, Edward scratched furrows in soil. Both were battles, but only one ended with bread on the table. So no, medieval England wasn't endless war. For most people, peace wasn't rare, it was normal. Their victories weren't recorded in chronicles, but in loaves of bread and full granaries, the quiet triumphs that actually kept the kingdom alive. You might think peasants in medieval England were chained to their villages, never seeing beyond a muddy road or the next field of turnips. The myth says they lived and died within a few square miles, as if the world outside their parish was a blank map with dragons scribbled on it. But the truth, medieval folk traveled more than you'd expect, sometimes for faith, sometimes for trade, and sometimes just for the sheer pull of curiosity. The flip is freeing. Markets, fairs, and pilgrimages drew villagers miles away from home. Imagine a dusty road winding toward Canterbury, filled with pilgrims carrying staffs and stories, bound together by prayers and blisters. Or picture a bustling town fair in Lincoln, where cloth from Flanders and spices from the East turned muddy fields into marketplaces of color and noise. Even ordinary peasants might walk a day or two to sell eggs, buy tools, or hear the latest gossip from travelers. Mainstream fact, pilgrimage was a central feature of medieval life, with destinations like Canterbury or Walsingham attracting thousands each year. Quirky tidbit. Some people collected pilgrimage badges, tiny pewter souvenirs, pinned to cloaks, basically the medieval version of fridge magnets. Scholarly debate. Historians argue whether most peasants traveled willingly or were compelled by obligations, like serving in armies or following their lords. The line between choice and duty was often blurry. Mini-character POV, Joan, a farmer's wife, clutches her basket of eggs as she squeezes into the crowd at a town fair. She gasps at the sight of bright red cloth, unlike anything she's ever seen. "It's prettier than a sunrise," she whispers, then haggles fiercely until she walks away with a scrap for her daughter's wedding dress. Joke 1. You think peasants never traveled? Some went farther on foot than you do with free Wi-Fi and a car. Joke 2. Pilgrimage badges were the medieval version of Instagram posts, proof you'd been there, done that. Joke 3. And let's be honest, most peasants didn't travel for enlightenment. They traveled because fairs had better beer. Callback. Remember John the Miller throwing dice in the village square? At a fair, he'd find opponents from miles away, meaning he could lose money to strangers, not just neighbors. Progress. So no, peasants weren't locked in invisible cages. Roads, fairs, and shrines carried them farther than myth admits, their footsteps weaving threads between villages, towns, and kingdoms. Medieval England was smaller than today's globe, but it was never as tiny as the myth makes you believe. You probably imagine medieval England as technologically frozen plows dragged by oxen, candles flickering weakly, and nothing resembling real invention until the Renaissance showed up centuries later. The myth says the Middle Ages were 1,000 years of stagnation, where progress slept as soundly as a peasant after harvest. But the truth is, invention never really stopped, just looked different from the gadgets in your imagination. The flip is ingenious. Medieval people built watermills and windmills to grind grain, saw wood, and even crush iron ore. They tinkered with mechanical clocks that rang bells on the hour, long before wristwatches ever existed. Imagine a monk in the cloister, winding gears carved from wood, listening as the first clock in the village chimed in. Everyone stared in awe, wondering how a machine could speak time. Farming tools improved too. The heavy plow, horse collars, and iron-tipped implements helped turn stubborn soil into bread. Not flashy, but life-changing. Mainstream fact: by the 12th century, England had thousands of watermills dotting riversides, making it one of the most mechanized societies in the world at the time. Quirky tidbit: some clocks had automatile wooden figures that popped out and waved or rang bells, the medieval version of a cuckoo clock. Scholarly debate: historians argue whether technological innovation slowed after the Black Death, or if labor shortages actually spurred creativity. As people looked for machines to do the work fewer hands could. Mini character POV: Brother Oswin, a monk, crouches beside the great gears of an early clock. He wipes sweat from his brow as the mechanism clicks. Suddenly, the bell clangs loudly. He grins and whispers, "Behold, time obeys us now." Villagers outside cheer, though one old man mutters, "A demon lives in that bell." Joke 1. You think medieval people had no tech, but they basically invented the world's first smart home device, just rang bells instead of ordering pizza. Joke 2. A watermill grinding grain was the medieval equivalent of broadband. Everyone wanted access, and fights broke out when it was down. Joke 3. And let's face it, medieval clocks were huge. If you strapped one to your wrist, you'd tip over. Callback: remember Edward the farmer groaning about weeds, fighting harder than armies? That heavy plow was his best weapon, a piece of medieval tech as vital as any knight's sword. So, no, the Middle Ages weren't a frozen wasteland of invention. They were full of worry wheels, creaking gears, and clever contraptions that whispered the future into a world we called backward. You probably imagine medieval England as frozen in time, a world where nothing ever changed: peasants in the fields, knights in armor, kings on thrones, century after century repeating like a scratched record. The myth insists the Middle Ages were static, 1,000 years of sameness before modernity finally woke the kingdom up. But step inside the timeline, and you'll see constant change shaping lives in ways the myth erases. The flip is sweeping. Dynasties rose and fell, borders shifted, and entire towns transformed. The Norman conquest of 1066 reshaped language, law, and landholding. Plagues like the Black Death rewrote the balance of labor, wages, and population. Markets grew, towns expanded, and the feudal world cracked under the weight of revolts like the peasants. Revolt in 1381. Imagine being born in 1000, hearing your village priest speak Old English, and dying in 1100 as your grandchildren chatter in a tongue laced with Norman French. That's not stasis, that's evolution in real time. Mainstream fact. The Black Death of the mid-14th century wiped out nearly half of England's population, reshaping everything from wages to religious belief. Quirky tidbit. Some survivors believed cats were spreading the plague, leading to mass killings of cats which ironically let rats multiply and made things worse. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Middle Ages ended with the Renaissance, the Reformation, or if endings are just tidy labels pasted on messy reality. Mini-character POV. Thomas, a boy in 1348, clutches his mother's hand as they walk through a half-empty village. "Where did everyone go?" he whispers. His mother squeezes his hand tighter. The world feels hollow, yet soon he'll see new markets rise, new lords falter, and new opportunities appear in the cracks of disaster. Joke 1. You think nothing changed, but in reality, medieval fashion alone could give TikTok trends a run for their money. Joke 2. Languages shifted so fast that by 1200, your great-grandkids might have thought you had a funny accent. Joke 3. And let's be honest, even plagues caused change. Suddenly peasants could charge higher rent, the original medieval promotion. Callback. Remember Margaret fining her neighbor for pigs? By the 1380s, peasants like her descendants were marching to London, demanding rights. From pigs to politics, some things escalate. So no, medieval England wasn't frozen in time. It was a living, shifting, unpredictable landscape where crowns toppled, languages twisted, and ordinary lives bent with the winds of change. The myth of stasis melts away, leaving a kingdom in motion, restless as the tides of the Channel. And now, as our journey through medieval England gently closes, let the clatter of swords and the chatter of markets fade into the distance. You've walked through drafty castles, trudged muddy fields, and even dipped into smoky baths. You've watched kings fume over parchments, peasants laugh over dice, and monks bend patiently over parchment by candlelight. 1,000 years collapsed into a single dream, and still the echoes linger. Picture yourself now, not in the bustle of a medieval fair or the chill of a castle hall, but somewhere quieter, meadow just beyond a village, where the grass bends in the evening wind. The church bell has rung its last note for the day. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, and the stars have begun to pierce the deep velvet sky. All the myths we peeled away, all the truths we uncovered, drift like whispers, softer and softer, until they feel less like lessons and more like lullabies. You see, medieval England wasn't endless gloom or endless glory. It was ordinary life, threaded with laughter, hardship, invention, and change, just like today. And maybe that's the gentlest truth of all. Even 1,000 years ago, people still longed for warmth, comfort, and connection, the same things that cradle you now. So let the mud dry on your boots, set aside the imagined crown or plow, and rest. Time itself moves more slowly here, as though the ticking of those early clocks has quieted into a hum, steady and calming. Breathe in once more, deep and easy. Let the stories settle into silence. Tomorrow, the world will wake bright again, but tonight, you are safe, you are still, and you can drift into sleep as softly as a candle flame fading in the dark.